Well, welcome to the Cut for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay. Just so glad you joined me for this week's video as we have the opportunity to dig into not only my sermon from Sunday, but our new sermon series here at the Canton United Methodist Church, and then just dig into a little bit of our history. Eric is off this week as the Vikings were playing last night, which was our normal recording time, and so just between everything going on in his world and his life, we're just going to have me for a little while. Just hope you enjoy today's episode. And as always, let's get into it. I just wanted to start off by talking about Advent. It was a very fun sermon series to preach alongside of some of my dearest friends. I really hope that you enjoyed the format of having the multiple voices that we're sharing and the way that they were able to share their stories and their impact and just how the birth of Christ was such a foundational moment for all of us in our faith. And so I just want to extend my thankfulness to Pastor Teresa Wetzel, Pastor Peggy Hansen, Beata Ferris, Eric Stearns, and then Pastor Stephanie Schneider. It was awesome to be able to spend that time with you when we were recording, and then just to share your stories throughout the entire season of Advent. So thank you to those that participated, and thanks to those that were able to either listen to the podcast or listen or watch the videos on YouTube. And now our sermon series that's starting off the year 2025, which I can hardly believe we're in, is about our identity. We are preaching through the 5 marks of a United Methodist, which comes from 2 places. First, it comes from a book by Steve Harper, who is an important person in our denomination around spiritual formation. He's written several books that I've enjoyed greatly, and just have the opportunity to hear some of his words reflected in the sermon. And his book is based off of another book, which comes from John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Movement, called The Character of a Methodist. And the 5 marks are, as we're going to see, or we have seen so far, we've talked so far about the fact that a Methodist is one who loves God, and a Methodist is one who rejoices in God. And next Sunday, we're going to be talking about what it means for us to give thanks. And then we'll round out the series by talking about how a Methodist is one who prays without ceasing or prays constantly. And then also we'll finish up on February 2nd by talking about how a Methodist loves others. This book, written by John Wesley, was born out of necessity. Basically, in 1742, the Methodist movement had grown to a point where it was becoming unwieldy for John Wesley to be the only person in charge of setting direction and teaching. And so, as a way of getting this definitive work out to as many people as possible, he wrote this short book called The Marks of a Methodist. And it is a document that has remained important for us as a part of the United Methodist Church. It's been kind of foundational to our identity, and so it's just been so much fun to be able to dig into that and to kind of nerd out a little bit, because as I've made mention of before, I am a bit of a church nerd. That has not changed at all, and I don't really envision that changing very much, but it is just good to have this reminder of who we are at the start of the year. As you might know, if you've been around the Cut for Time podcast very often, you'll know that Eric is prone to asking me why this sermon series when we start a new sermon series, because I do usually try to have a good answer to that. And the reason why I wanted to start the year with this sermon series is because the start of the year can feel like we are in just this time of flux and this time of change. And so it is good for us to remember our foundation. As we started worship a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the fact that the time period between Christmas and New Year's Day, and then whenever school starts back up, can just be this wild time of not really knowing what day it is and not really knowing what we're supposed to do, because a lot of us do have an extended break. So in the midst of that uncertainty of what day it is and what are we supposed to be doing, but then also just in this idea of how do we live because of the birth of Jesus Christ? We're doing this sermon series based on our identity. There has also been a lot of change in our denomination as of late. The last couple of years have been times of transformation, times of change. We've had 2 different sessions of General Conference, which is our global meeting, and what has the right to speak officially on behalf of the whole church is the Book of Discipline, which is reviewed at General Conference. And we have made some changes to our denomination, to our structure, and some of those changes have not been very popular with certain parts of the population, and that has led to either intentional disinformation or just misunderstanding and misinformation being put out about who we are, who is the United Methodist Church. There are wild things that you'll hear about us that are not based in reality or based in truth, like that we no longer believe in the virgin birth. That could not be any further from the truth. We do not believe in the divinity of Jesus, which, again, does not bear truth to that. Those are still things that are foundational to who we are as a part of a Christian denomination. Those are fundamental tenets of the Christian faith. There are things that have changed. There are things that we have expanded our belief in, and just, but I don't think we've, at any point have we laid aside any of the traditional and classic traits of the Christian faith, any of the tenets of the Christian faith. So I'm preaching this sermon series as a way of grounding us in who we are, who we really are, and as a way of combating some of that misinformation and disinformation that has been out there about the United Methodist Church. And it's also my hope that this foundation of this sermon series will lead us through the rest of the year. When we're talking about these 5 things, these 5 tenets, I really hope that they are prescriptive for who we are going to be in the year 2025 and going forward, as we are the people, or we are a people who love God, who rejoice in God, who have that joy of the Lord that we talked about on Sunday, that give thanks to God in the midst of all circumstances, that pray constantly, and that also do seek to love our neighbor. During the first week of the sermon series, I talked about how we base the scripture on the greatest commandment, where Jesus says, Jesus has asked this question intended to trap him about what the greatest commandment is. And Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then he says the second is like it, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so we are bookending our conversation in the midst of this great commandment that Jesus gives to us. It is our call to live out. So I'm hoping that this will be something that propels us through the rest of the year, that this can be a time where we as the Canton United Methodist Church and anyone that is impacted by our church whatsoever grows in their love of God. Grows in the joy of the Lord, grows in their ability and their capacity to give thanks, that grows in their prayer life, and then also does in fact grow in their love of their community, of others, of however else we look out beyond ourselves as a church. This is also linked to a new member class, which is currently happening Sundays after worship, and we are looking forward to adding new members to our church on the 2nd of February. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a plug that class is still open to any and all that want to come be a part of it, and there is still time to join the church as a part of our new member class this time around. There will also be another one throughout the year as well, so if you didn't take that step this time, if you're interested and you didn't know it was happening, because again, that start of the year time can be such a wonderful little escape from schedules and reality, just know that there will be another opportunity to dig into that new member class as well. So, with that all before us and all in our minds, I just want to spend a little bit of time digging in as we're talking about our identity. We're talking about what it is that grounds us and who we are, and a lot of our identity has been formed by our founder. Both as Christians, as we are founded by Christ, but also as United Methodists, as we are formed and founded by John Wesley. And so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about United Methodist history, about Wesley history, and then just seeing that as a way forward for us to understand ourselves better, and then just kind of get more out of the sermon series together. But just wanted to hop in and do a little bit of history on John Wesley. John Wesley was born in 1703. His parents were Samuel and Susanna Wesley. John Wesley was one of 17 children that Samuel and Susanna had, one of 10 that survived to adulthood. So there was a big family with a lot happening. Samuel was a priest in the Church of England, and Susanna did not work outside of the home, but definitely had a lot of work to do because she had a lot of kids. I was telling the new member class this on Sunday that Susanna Wesley kind of took care of the kids, and it was also instrumental in their faith development as well. Despite the fact that Samuel was a priest and serving the church, there was just a lot that Susanna did. Susanna was also had a ministry in her own right. She led Bible studies and just did other things around the community. And it was kind of always a little bit interesting to read that people liked Susanna a little bit more than they liked Samuel most of the time. But Susanna Wesley was in charge of the spiritual formation of her children, and took that role very seriously. It was also told about Susanna Wesley that when she wanted a break or when she needed to be in a time of prayer and study of Scripture, her indicator to her household that she was taking that time was to flop her apron over the top of her head and just kind of hide in a prayer apron, and to have that time to commune with God through prayer, uninterrupted, because her kids knew not to bother her when her apron was over her head. Family spent most of its time at a place called Epworth, which is why you will hear that word Epworth around the United Methodist Church an awful lot, because of all the places that they lived during Samuel being a priest, and of all the places that John Wesley lived in his life. He always thought of Epworth as his favorite. Maybe in no small part because of what we're going to talk about next. In 1709, so John Wesley would have been 5 or 6 or 7. The rectory or the parsonage in Epworth burned down. There was a fire. The residents did everything that they could to drive the Wesleys out of town, because Samuel Wesley was not a very popular pastor or a rector at that time. And so they lived in the parsonage, but the people did everything in their power to kind of help the Wesleys know that it was time for them to move on, but Samuel Wesley never got the hint. They would damage their crops and livestock. They would refuse to pay tithes to the church. And then, like I talked about, there was a fire at the parsonage. And there is some rumor, this is not confirmed, but there is some rumor to indicate that the fire itself may have been started by the church itself, by church members itself, as a way of trying to drive the Wesleys out of town. The problem is that John Wesley was trapped in that fire, and he was rescued at kind of the last second, and he always identified himself as a brand who had been plucked from the fire in that moment, and it was clear to Susanna and clear to the rest of the family that God clearly had a big call on John Wesley's life as a result of his dramatic life-saving adventure in the rectory at Epworth. So things continued until John Wesley was a college student. He was a student at Christ Church College at Oxford University from 1720, and then in 1726 he was elected to be a fellow, which is a professor, at Lincoln College at Oxford as well. He was at Oxford as a professor for 2 years before 1728. He was able to serve as a curate or an associate pastor alongside Samuel, his dad, both at Epworth. Again, that was kind of his favorite spot, and then at Root, Lincolnshire, which is where the family moved after serving in Epworth. In 1729, however, Oxford asked him to return to take back his position as a fellow, and this was at the time that Charles Wesley, John Wesley's younger brother, was also a student at Oxford, and Charles had already started meeting with some friends of his because they wanted to take their faith more seriously. And so they met for Bible study, and they asked John Wesley to kind of take the lead in that. And that's what they did. This is the formation of what's called the Holy Club, which was not a name that they picked, but a name that was given to them by those that were mocking them for their rigorous attention to their faith. They were called the Bible Moths and the Holy Club, and they were even called Methodists, because John and Charles Wesley and a few of Charles's friends had developed a method for spiritual formation. And their method focused around scripture study and the reading of devotional books, on their own, but also together as a group. They would study throughout the week and then come together and discuss. They would also take time in prayer with and for one another. They would examine their spiritual lives. One of the questions that they would ask each other is, "How is it with your soul?" That was an important question to the Holy Club, and it continues to be an important question for us as Methodists. When I was at the University of Sioux Falls, which is a predominantly Baptist institution, my college advisor, whose name was John Higgle, knew of my background in United Methodism, knew that I was United Methodist, and I was heading towards ordination in the United Methodist Church. Even as a college student, that was kind of the designed path for me, that I feel God was calling me towards. And any time that I met with John Higgle, he would ask me, "How is it with your soul?" I don't know if he did that with other students because I was not privy to those conversations, but I just think it was because he knew of my background, of my denominational identity. He knew that that was an important question for me, and so he was always willing to ask that and then answer and listen to my answer, no matter what it was. More often than not, it was going fine, but there were some hard times where it was just really great to have an advisor that knew my heritage and history and knew of the question to ask to really get at the heart of what was going on. So aside from that, they would also receive communion weekly, if not more frequently. So that was kind of a big part of the early Methodist movement. The Methodist movement and the Holy Club had a societal component as well, as they would also take food to poor families, visit the lonely in prisons, visit the sick in hospitals, and they'd also teach orphans how to read. This was revolutionary at the time. This was not a thing that was happening. As we talked about in the sermon a couple of weeks ago, faith for those in the Church of England had become more of a hobby, and that drove John Wesley crazy because John Wesley, knew the gospel. He knew what Jesus had asked people to do. The gospel had not changed from the time that Jesus said it to the time that John Wesley heard it to the time that we hear it now today. We know that there is a societal impact that our faith is called to make. And when John Wesley saw people not living that out and not living that way, it drove him crazy. And so he was more than happy to be a part of this societal change that the Holy Club was making. Things changed radically in the 1730s. In 1735 and until 1737, John Wesley was asked to move from England to Georgia, the colony of Georgia in the United States. He was invited by the founder of the Georgia colony, a man named James Oglethorpe. And when John Wesley was first thinking about what was going to happen next, he had these grand visions of ministering to indigenous people, of really spreading the gospel and preaching it to unbelievers. And he also found himself as the third rector or pastor at Christ Church, which was the church of the Georgia colony, kind of sponsored by the Church of England. And since John was an ordained priest in the Church of England, he was able to go and be a part of that. Unfortunately, much like his dad, John Wesley was not a very popular pastor because, again, church had become more of a hobby. Faith had become more of just one of those things that people do or did, and it didn't seem to make much of an impact on their actually lived lives. And again, that drove John Wesley crazy, and so people did not like him very much because he challenged them. He pushed them maybe a little bit too far. There's a famous quotation from one of John Wesley's journals where one of his parishioners came up to him and said, "I like nothing that you have to say." They did not sugarcoat it. They did not hide it. And it just did not go very well for a lot of reasons. And then Charles Wesley fell ill because his brother was also over in Georgia, again, working for Oglethorpe, not in a church sense, but as his secretary. But Charles Wesley fell ill and had to return to England, and John decided to leave at that point too. There was also some drama with a woman named Sophie Hopke. John Wesley had kind of of fallen sweet on her. They liked each other quite a bit. Sophie Hopke wanted John to propose marriage to her, but he thought that would be a distraction from his goal of spreading the gospel, from serving the church. And so he just never proposed to her. And then she started dating somebody else and married somebody else. And when it came time for her to receive communion, John Wesley publicly refused to serve her, kind of out of his own spite. And that was kind of the last straw of his time in Georgia. It ended very quickly after that. And John Wesley went back to Britain, just a very depressed person. It had not gone well for him with this thing that he felt God had called him to do and be a part of. And that can be really hard. That can be really damaging for someone to go through. And so he spent some time with a group of Christians called the Moravians, kind of out of a German spiritual persuasion. On the road home, or not the road, on the boat ride home, there was a major storm and everyone was freaking out, including John Wesley. Everybody except for these Moravians. The Moravians took more of an Acts 16 posture towards the storm. They were singing hymns. They were singing spiritual songs. They were delighting in their faith. They knew that God had them in the hollow of God's hand. And John Wesley was just kind of thrown by that. He saw the assurance of their faith in Jesus, and he knew that he didn't have that. And so he spent quite a bit of time with the Moravians trying to figure out what exactly it was that he was lacking. And later in 1738, John Wesley learned exactly what that was. On May 24th, which is what we now celebrate as Aldersgate Day in the life of the United Methodist Church. That is a day that John Wesley went to spiritual society at Aldersgate Street, which was a location in London. And someone was reading Luther's preface to the book of Romans, so a commentary on the book of Romans. And John Wesley writes in his journal that as someone was describing the change that God works in someone's heart, he felt his heart strangely warmed, and he felt that he trusted Christ and Christ alone for his salvation. So did you catch that? Let's maybe unpack that a little bit really quickly, because by this time, John Wesley was already an ordained priest in the Church of England. He was already a pastor. He was already serving churches. He is already helping lead people in their faith through the Holy Club. He had already been a missionary and also a pastor at the same time. And it wasn't until after all of this stuff took place that he felt that he trusted Christ and Christ alone for his salvation, which is kind of the whole part of salvation that is, really important. It is important for us to put our trust in Christ, to recognize that we cannot save ourselves, that we cannot work ourselves into a deep faith in the way that John Wesley was trying to. And yet it took that long for him to finally get it. And after that, things really started to change. After that, the Methodist movement kind of started in earnest, because now their founder, their leader, actually believed in Jesus. So the big major shift that starts to happen in John Wesley's life is that he starts to hear about this open air preaching that one of the members of the Holy Club named George Whitefield is doing. And John Wesley just can't believe it. John Wesley is kind of like me. He's a church nerd, and he believes that sermons should only be happening in the context of worship in a church building. That is where this stuff should take place. But George Whitefield did not have that same idea, that same outlook. He preached anywhere and everywhere. He preached out of doors, to quote it in the way that John Wesley does in his sermons, or in his journal rather. And finally, on April 2nd of 1739, John Wesley decides to visit George Whitefield, to watch him preach. And he sees how people respond to the word of God, and he writes these words in his journal, which are some of my favorite words. At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile, and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation. I submitted to be more vile. Can you think of anything funnier to call vile than open-air preaching of the gospel? And so John Wesley starts to do this open-air preaching, while also still making invitations, inviting himself, getting his name out there, trying to get more and more people involved in this Methodist movement that's happening through his ministry. And so this open-air preaching is not very popular among the same circles that John Wesley's riding in. because, like I talked about, he himself started out being very skeptical and not very receptive to it. And so there were others that felt the same way that he did. And so John Wesley's reputation preceded him in a lot of places. And many churches where he asked to preach, which was his right as an ordained priest in the Church of England or the Anglican Church, many churches told him no. And he was not allowed to preach there. And many churches, after he had preached there, asked him never to return. I am a big fan of John Wesley's journals. I have a copy over on my bookshelf that I've read from quite often and quite a lot. And it's funny to me, there's almost like a 3-page run in this time period where all of his journal entries happen on Sunday. And it's like, I preached at St. Anne's, was asked not to return. I preached at St. So-and-so's and was asked not to return. I was denied being able to preach at a certain church and then was asked not to return. This kept happening over and over and over again. And so this is just kind of a part of that mythos of the early Methodist movement, so that John Wesley was doing something radically different. Despite the fact that he was never excommunicated from the Church of England, despite the fact that he, lived his entire life as an ordained Anglican priest, he was not very popular in Anglican circles because he was challenging them to take their faith more seriously. And he was doing things like reaching out to the poor, and that was just not something that was done in that day and in that time. But people responded. By 1742, it became too unwieldy for him to be doing all this work by himself. And so, like I talked about at the start of this podcast, he wrote a book called The Character of a Methodist. And this movement, the book was necessitated because the movement had started to become large and ecumenical. Steve Harper, in the book The 5 Marks of the Methodist, says that Anglicans, Quakers, Puritans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and even Roman Catholics and non-denominational Christians turned to him for spiritual guidance. That was how the movement spread. It got organized, it got kind of institutionalized, and the movement would continue to grow as they built chapels, like a place called the Foundry in London, and eventually the New Room called Bristol. And the New Room still exists as a Wesleyan history museum. And by the way, it is 100% on my bucket list. I would love to go and be there. But they also, the Methodist movement formalized and started to build stuff like orphanages. And eventually the movement moved across the sea to America to form what is now the United Methodist Church. That happened in large parts due to the American Revolution. Because of the Declaration of Independence being sent over from the Americas to England, the Church of England lost control of its buildings and the congregations that they had established as Anglican churches in America, or the Episcopal Church. And so many priests went back to Britain, and it left congregations without leadership. This is when John Wesley ordained 2 men named Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, and the Methodist Episcopal Church would begin in earnest at the Christmas Conference of 1748. And the rest, as they say, is history. As the American colonies became states, as America started to expand to the west, the Methodist Church grew alongside of it. And the Methodist Church has been through a lot of the same things that the American country has been through. Much like our country, we've been through deep division. Much like during the time of slavery, leading up to the Civil War, there were Methodists on both sides of that conflict around what the role of slavery should be in our country. And that led to our church splitting into North and South, the Methodist Episcopal Church North and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Those 2 denominations would reunite in 1939 and drop the word Episcopal from their name, so we just became the Methodist Church, and that was our identifier until 1968, when the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church merged on April 28th of 1968, and that was the formation of the United Methodist Church. We took the United from the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist from us as the Methodist Church, and stuck them together to become the United Methodist Church. We have never, despite everything we've been through, despite all of our history, despite all of the things that have happened around us through our world, we've never lost sight of our mission, which is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Hope you enjoyed that little walk through Methodist history. I know that's a lot of information really quickly. It's very kind of similar to the presentation I just made to our new member class and also to my confirmation class that I'll be making to our confirmation class in a couple of weeks. But it is just an important part of having this foundation laid. We are moving forward in mission together here at the Canton United Methodist Church, which our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ who make a difference. And we do join together with all United Methodists in our mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So just hope that you've enjoyed this time with me today. We'll be back next week with a normal episode, and just would invite you to join us for worship on Sunday at 10 o'clock as we continue this sermon series, both in person at the church or online on Facebook Live, and then we'll see you back here for the podcast next week. Thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.